The rain drummed on the roof of the house as if trying to reach my consciousness. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of herbal tea and looked out the window at the wet maple trees along Benefit Street. Providence has always been especially beautiful in the fall, even in the rain. Is 67 years old a long time or a short time? Sometimes I felt like my life had gone by in a flash, and sometimes I felt like every minute I lived was a story. My name is Verna Thornton, and I have been a widow for 5 years now. My husband Freeman died of a heart attack while sitting in this chair reading his favorite book about the Civil War. We lived together for 42 years. 42 years of life together, of breakfasts at this table, of evening conversations, of plans for the future. And now, there was only me and these memories. The phone was lying next to me on the table. I looked at it and sighed. Harlan hadn't called for 3 weeks. My son, my only child, my Harlan. I remember how he took his first steps in this very room, how he read the first word from the book I held in my hands. He is now 42, the same age as Freeman and I were married. We used to be close. He came to me with all his problems, joys, and doubts. I was the first person he called when he got a scholarship to Brown University. I remember his eyes full of pride when he defended his degree in economics. Freeman squeezed my hand so hard that it left marks. We were so happy, so proud. Our son is a graduate of a prestigious university, the first in the family with a university degree. And then everything started to change. Gradually, imperceptibly. First, the phone calls became shorter, then less frequent. He explained it by being busy at work, and I understood. A financial analyst in a large company is a responsible position. I never wanted to be a burden. I poured myself more tea and went to the window. The rain had intensified, drops trickling down the glass, turning the world outside into a blurry watercolor. Somewhere out there, a 20-minute drive away, my son and his family lived in a luxurious house on the east side. I visited him less and less often. Everything changed completely when Harlan married Telsey. She was the kind of woman who knew what she wanted from life. Tall, slender, with impeccable hair and manicure, always in perfectly matched outfits. A corporate lawyer who grew up in a wealthy family from Boston. She never said it directly, but I could feel that she was ashamed of her mother-in-law, a simple public school history teacher. At first, Telsey tried to be polite. She invited me to dinners and took an interest in my life. But in her voice, I always heard that special tone of voice that you use with small children or very old people. A condescending tone. I didn't like that tone, but I kept quiet. For Harlan's sake. When my children were born, first Lowry and then Paxton, I hoped that everything would change. I dreamed of being a grandmother who baked cookies, told stories, and helped with homework. But Telsey had her own vision. The children had nannies, tutors, private schools, and a schedule filled with various clubs. There was no room for a grandmother who had worked in a regular school all her life. Lowry turned 14 this year. She is tall like her father, with Telsey's eyes, cold and attentive. She rarely looked at me, and when she did, it was as if she was forcing herself. "Hi, Grandma," she would say, looking at her phone. "How are you?" And she didn't wait for an answer because she didn't really care. Paxton is 12, and he just repeats the behavior of his sister and parents. Sometimes I notice something different in his eyes, maybe curiosity or sympathy, but it quickly disappeared under the influence of his family. The last time I was at their house, at Christmas 6 months ago, Telsey asked me not to touch the crystal figurines on the mantelpiece. "They are very fragile, Virna," she said, sounding as if I were a naughty child. I didn't touch them. I just stood there and watched, feeling like a stranger in my son's house. Harlan then defended his wife. "Mom, you know these things are very expensive. They are from the collection of Telsey's parents. That night I left early saying I had a headache. In fact, it was my heart that hurt. My son had turned into someone I didn't recognize. He was ashamed of me, of his roots, of our humble past. Sometimes I thought he was even ashamed of the memory of his father, a simple, honest man who worked as an engineer at a small factory and never pursued luxury. 6 months have passed since that Christmas. I've seen my grandchildren only once, when Harlan brought them to my house for an hour while Telsey was at some important meeting. The kids sat on the couch staring at their phones, and Harlan kept looking at his watch. I tried to get them interested in old photo albums. "Look," This is your dad when he was your age, Paxton. Paxton glanced at it for a moment and shrugged. What terrible shoes, Lori said, grimacing. And those jeans. Ew. Harlan pretended not to hear. I closed the album. When they left, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I pulled out a box of cards that Harlan had made for me on Mother's Day when he was little. To the best mom in the world. I love you to the moon and back. You are my superheroine. Now those words seemed to be written by someone else. The rain outside the window began to subside. I finished my tea and washed the cup. My teacher's pension was modest, but it was enough. Freeman had been frugal and left me a good will. The house was fully paid off, and I could afford a quiet, peaceful life. Sometimes I met up with a few former school colleagues, attended a book club at the local library, and helped my neighbor Georgina take care of her garden. Life went on as usual, slowly and predictably. I was about to start preparing lunch when the phone rang. Harlan's name came up on the screen. My heart beat faster. I picked up the phone, trying to sound calm. Hello? Mom, it's me. Harlan's voice sounded unusually upbeat. I have good news. What? I asked, feeling my lips stretch into a smile. It had been so long since I had heard joy in his voice. I've been promoted to Executive Director of Finance. This is an incredible leap in my career. The salary is almost twice as much, the office overlooking the city, a personal assistant. Oh, Harlan, that's great. I'm so happy for you, son. For a moment, I thought my old Harlan had returned. He spoke quickly with enthusiasm, as he used to when he shared his successes with me. We're having a gala dinner at Loscar this Friday at 7. Telsey invited all the important people from my company, her colleagues, a few friends. He kept talking and I waited. I was waiting for him to say something. And I want you to come, Mom. This is an important day for me, and I want to share it with you. But he didn't say that. Instead, he started talking about some partner of the firm who was coming all the way from New York. Harlan, I interrupted him quietly, do you want me to come to this dinner? There was a short pause. I could almost physically feel him tense up on the other end of the line. Well, yes, of course, Mom. If you want. It's going to be a very formal event, you know. Everyone in evening gowns, company directors. There's that note in his voice again. Shame. Doubt. I'll come, I said firmly. I have a nice dress. I won't embarrass you, Harlan. Mom, I didn't mean it. He sighed. Lascari is a very expensive restaurant. Dinner there costs. I have money for dinner, I interrupted him. I am your mother, Harlan. Another pause. Okay, he finally said. I'll see you on Friday, 7 in the evening. He said a quick goodbye and hung up. I put the phone down and walked over to the mirror in the hallway. Gray hair in a simple bun, wrinkles around my eyes and mouth, simple earrings that Freeman had given me for my 30th wedding anniversary. An ordinary elderly woman, not a CEO, not a lawyer, not a socialite, just Verna Thornton, a former history teacher. I opened my closet and pulled out a navy blue dress I had bought for an old friend's funeral last year. It was elegant enough for a dinner in an expensive restaurant, perhaps a little old-fashioned, but neat and strict. I tried it on and critically examined myself. Yes, it would fit. I wasn't going to argue with fate and pretend to be someone else, but I also didn't want my son to be more ashamed of me than usual. I spent the rest of the day preparing lunch, then reading a book and thinking about Harlan's invitation. Did he really want me there? Or was it just a gesture of politeness? Or maybe Tessie insisted to show everyone what a caring daughter-in-law she was. It was gradually getting dark outside. The rain had stopped, and the wet streets glistened in the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a thunderclap. The storm was moving away, but it was still there. I made more tea and sat down in the chair where Freeman had died. Sometimes I thought I could still feel his presence, especially in difficult moments. What would you have done, Freeman? I asked quietly. There was no answer, but I knew what he would say. He's our son, Virna, our son. Yes, Harlan was our son. And despite everything that had happened in recent years, I still loved him. I loved the little boy who hugged me every time I came home from school. I loved the teenager who spent hours telling me about his dreams of becoming a very important person. I loved the young man who cried when he got his first big raise at work and called me at 2 in the morning to share his joy. Did I love the man he is today? I didn't know. But I did know that I was going to that dinner. Not for Telsey, not to impress Harlan's colleagues, but for myself and for Freeman's memory. To try once again to find in my son's eyes the boy I raised. With that decision, I went upstairs to go to bed. Tomorrow I would have to go to the hairdresser, maybe buy new shoes. I knew that Telsey would give me a critical look as soon as I crossed the threshold of the restaurant. I knew that the kids would barely nod at me and go back to their phones. I knew that Harlan would be nervous about introducing me to his important colleagues. But I also knew I had to go. Because somewhere deep inside, I still hoped that one day my son would remember who he really was. And maybe he would remember who I am to him. Friday came faster than I expected. I spent the last 3 days preparing for dinner. I went to the hairdresser, old Milton, who had been cutting my hair for over 20 years. He gave me a neat style, tinted my gray hair a little to give it a more even silver hue. "Is there a special occasion, Verna?" he asked, looking at the result. "My son was promoted at work," I answered proudly. "A celebratory dinner at Lascar." Milton whistled. "Not bad. It's the most expensive restaurant in town." I nodded, trying not to think about how much dinner would cost. I had the money, but spending that much on one dinner seemed excessive. Freeman had always been frugal, and I had learned this habit over the years of marriage. But this was a special occasion. The hardest part was choosing a gift. What to give to a son who seems to have everything, whose wife cringes at the sight of anything that costs less than a few $100s. I went shopping for a long time, but couldn't find anything suitable. It was either too expensive or too simple. And then I remembered my father's cufflink. Freeman had a single pair of silver cufflinks that he had gotten from his father. He almost never wore them, only on the most important occasions. Our wedding, Harlan's baptism, Harlan's graduation. I found them in a small box where I kept my late husband's most valuable possessions. The cufflinks were silver, with a simple geometric pattern. Nothing particularly expensive or sophisticated, but they had a history. They were part of our family. I decided to give them to Harlan. Maybe it would remind him of his roots, of his father, who would be so proud of him now. I ordered a beautiful gift box from a jewelry store and added a small card with the inscription, "Your father would be pleased if you wore these. Love, Mom." As I was getting ready that evening, I felt a strange excitement. It was as if I was going to meet not my son and his family, but strangers who needed to be impressed. I wore a navy blue dress, neat black low-heeled shoes that I had bought especially for the occasion, and modest pearl earrings, a gift from Freeman on our 20th wedding anniversary. The last time I looked at myself in the mirror, I remembered Harlan sitting on my bed as a little boy, watching me get ready for the parties. "You are the most beautiful mom in the world," he would say, his eyes shining with sincere admiration. Where is that boy now? Is there any of that pure, open heart left in the stern financial director? I called a taxi to the restaurant. The driver, a young man from the Dominican Republic, whistled enthusiastically when I told him the address. "Loscari? The average check there is more than I earn in a day." I smiled weakly. "Oh, it's a celebration!" The guy smiled in the rearview mirror. "You must be very proud of him." "Yes," I answered, although it was only a half-truth. Loscari is located in an old building in the center of Providence. It was once a bank, and now it is one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Huge columns, marble staircases, crystal chandeliers. Everything screamed wealth and status. A uniformed doorman opened the door for me, slightly grimacing as he examined my outfit. My dress may not have been as expensive as most of the other visitors, but it was elegant and appropriate. At least I thought so. The young woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm here for the Thornton family dinner. My son, Harlan Thornton, is celebrating a promotion." She quickly looked at the list on her computer. "Yes, the dinner is in Mr. Thornton's honor, and we have the Emerald Room reserved. Let me show you to it." We walked through the main hall of the restaurant, where elegant couples and small groups sat at tables. Waiters in white shirts and black vests glided silently between the tables. The restaurant was beautiful, I had to admit. Restrained luxury, exquisite details, subdued light from crystal chandeliers. The Emerald Room was a separate room with a large oval table in the middle. When I entered, about 15 people had already gathered there. Harlan was sitting in the center of the room, with Telsey next to him in a stunning emerald green dress, the color of the room, I gathered. Lowry and Paxton were sitting next to their mother, both in evening wear that looked way too grown up for their age. Harlan spotted me, and for a moment an emotion flashed across his face. Surprise? Disappointment? But he quickly composed himself and stood up. "Mom, you came," he said, coming over to me. He quickly hugged me, barely touching me, and then pulled back. "Come, I'll introduce you to everyone." He gestured around the room. "This is my mother, Verna. Not Mom, but my mother." Officially, distantly. Several people nodded at me with polite smiles. "And these," Harlan continued, "are my colleagues and friends. Mr. Davison, our CEO, Ms. Caldwell, our general counsel, Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard, our longtime friends." Names and titles merged into one. All of these people looked like they were on the cover of a magazine. Impeccable hairstyles, expensive suits and dresses, confident smiles. I was shown to a seat at the end of the table, far from Harlan and Telsey. An elderly man, who was introduced as Telsey's uncle, and a young woman whose name I couldn't remember sat next to me. "So you're Harlan's mom," said Telsey's uncle as I sat down. "I mean, I used to be." "Oh, a teacher." He nodded with the look of someone who had just heard something extremely boring. "That's a noble profession." And he immediately returned to talking to the woman on the other side. I took a small box of cufflinks out of my purse and looked at Harlan. He was completely engaged in a conversation with Mr. Davison. He was laughing and gesturing, his face shining with enthusiasm and a desire to impress. I decided to wait with the gift until a more appropriate moment. The waiter brought the menu. I carefully opened it and almost gasped at the prices. $80 for a salad, $120 for the main course. "Order whatever you want. The company is paying for everything tonight," Mr. Davison announced, and the table erupted in cheers. I breathed out a sigh of relief and decided to order something inexpensive, a simple fish and vegetables. The conversation at the table was lively. They talked about the real estate market, new investment opportunities, someone's new house on Cape Cod, and private schools. I sat in silence, listening. It wasn't that I didn't have anything to say. It was just that no one was addressing me or including me in the conversation. Telsey was telling me about her last visit to a spa in New York. "It was divine, wasn't it, Lori? I'm thinking of flying there every month. Their masseurs are magicians." "Absolutely, Mom," said Lori. "Especially that golden peel. My skin has never looked better." A 14-year-old girl talking about a golden peel. I remembered Harlan when he was her age, collecting bottles to buy himself a new soccer ball. "Do you go to the spa, Verna?" Telsey suddenly asked, turning to me. All eyes were on me. "No," I answered honestly. "Honey, oatmeal. It works just as well as a golden peel." There was an awkward silence. Telsey smiled, the kind of smile you usually give to children who have said something naive. "Of course," she said. "Home remedies. How nice." And she went back to talking to Mrs. Caldwell. Harlan didn't even look in my direction. The first course came out. My fish turned out to be a tiny piece on a huge plate, surrounded by some foam and sauce droplets. The food was delicious, but there was so little of it that I could barely taste it. "How's your pension, Mom?" Harlan suddenly asked across the table. I noticed his shoulders tense. He was obviously worried that I might ask him for money right there in front of all these important people. "It's fine, thanks," I said calmly. "Your father was frugal." "Dad was always frugal," Harlan said, and several people around the table smiled as if it were a joke. "Not frugal, but smart," I corrected. "He knew the value of money and worked to provide us with everything we needed." There was another awkward pause. "That's so sweet," Mrs. Caldwell said, looking at me indulgently. "It's funny when people of our generation talk about good old values," Mr. Davison added, addressing Harlan but looking at me, "as if this generation has no values." "I absolutely agree," Harlan echoed. "My father was a great man, but the times were different. Today you have to be more aggressive, more ambitious." I looked at my son and did not recognize him. This person who was actually apologizing for his father was not the boy I raised. The conversation turned to some new investment opportunities. I dropped out of it again, focusing on my food. When dessert was served, something incredibly delicious with chocolate and berries, Telsey suddenly noticed my dress. Is that a new dress, Verna? It's an interesting color choice for an event like this. No, it's not, I answered. But I thought it was quite suitable. Oh, of course, she said quickly. It's just that everyone is wearing brighter colors now. But your choice is classic. I knew what that meant. Old-fashioned, not interesting, not expensive enough. Thank you, I said simply, deciding not to be provoked. Lori whispered something to Paxton, and they both giggled as they looked at me. I pretended not to notice. The conversation continued, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. Everyone but me. I felt invisible, uninvited, a stranger at this party. Finally, I decided to give Harlan my gift. I got up and walked over to his seat. He was talking to Mr. Davison about some new yacht he had purchased. Harlan, I said quietly, I would like to give you a small gift on the occasion of your promotion. He turned around, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Now, Mom? He asked, casting a quick glance at Mr. Davison. Yes, if you don't mind. I handed him a small box. Harlan took it with obvious reluctance and quickly opened it. His face changed when he saw the cufflinks. Are these your father's cufflinks? He asked. And for a moment I thought I saw something like a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Yes, I said. I think he would want you to have them, especially now that you've achieved what he always wanted for you. What is it, dear? Asked Telsey, leaning over. My father's old cufflinks, Harlan replied, showing her the box. Oh, how sentimental, she said. But darling, they don't really go with your new Brioni suits. And the silver looks a little, you know. Of course they're old-fashioned, Harlan said quickly, closing the box. But it's a good memory. Thanks, Mom. He slipped the box into his jacket pocket and went back to talking to Mr. Davison. I slowly went back to my seat, feeling the pain growing inside me. The cufflinks that Freeman kept as his most precious treasure, which he wore only on special days, were rejected as old-fashioned. No one else paid attention to me. Conversations around the table were about investments, new restaurants, trendy resorts, and the latest car models. Harlan was laughing at Mr. Davison's jokes. Telsey was discussing the latest fashion trends with the women, and the children were quietly playing a game on their phones. Dinner went on endlessly. Expensive dishes followed each other, and I could barely taste them. Every minute, something inside me was shrinking, like an invisible spring about to explode. My hands tightened on the napkin under the table. There was a lot of noise around, glasses clinking, and conversations full of snobbery and complacency. But I felt like I was under an invisible hood. I heard everything, but I didn't have the strength to join in. The waiters, like silent shadows, slid between the chairs, taking away empty plates and bringing new ones. Their faces remained impassive, professionally indifferent, but sometimes it seemed to me that one of them gave me a sympathetic look. Perhaps I was just looking for some kind of support in this alien world of luxury, where even my own son seemed like a stranger. When coffee and tea were served, I asked for plain black tea without additives. The young waiter was slightly surprised, as something more exotic and sophisticated was obviously ordered here. Telsey asked for some rare jasmine oolong, the name of which the waiter pronounced with such reverence as if it were a sacred artifact. Lowry and Paxton ordered desserts with so many ingredients and such fancy names that I involuntarily thought of my homemade apple pies that Harlan loved so much as a child. The conversations around the table split into several groups, and I completely lost track of the general conversation. Harlan, Mr. Davison, and two other men in impeccable suits that cost probably as much as my monthly income were lively discussing some investment opportunities. I could only catch a few phrases about interest rates, risks, and potential profits. Their eyes burned with the excitement of predators who had scented their prey. Telsey and several exquisitely dressed women were discussing new rejuvenation procedures that apparently cost fabulous amounts of money. They were comparing some techniques, naming names of famous cosmetologists, exchanging spa contacts. Just imagine, Marion, Telsey said, glancing slightly in my direction. Rejuvenation at the cellular level. In 10 years, no one will even know you're over 40. Oh, that's incredible, said the blonde with the flawless hairstyle. My husband says I look younger than my secretary, and she's only 27. They laughed, and in their laughter I felt something artificial, as if they were playing roles in some play about the high life. I involuntarily touched my wrinkles around my eyes, the traces of the years I had lived, the anxieties, the joys, the sleepless nights at Harlan's sick bedside, the hours I had spent checking students' papers. I had never been ashamed of these wrinkles, but here, among these women with their tightened faces and glowing skin, I suddenly felt old and unattractive. The young people, Lowry, Paxton, and a couple of other teenagers I didn't know, sat a little further away, staring at their expensive phones. They talked quietly and occasionally giggled softly, glancing at the adults. Once Lori gave me a long, appraising look and then whispered something to her friend. They both smiled, and it was far from friendly. I was sitting next to Telsey's elderly uncle, whose name had already slipped my mind. After a few formal questions about my life, to which he didn't seem to be listening for answers, he lost all interest in me and returned to talking to the woman on the other side. They were discussing their family tree, which I gathered from their haughty remarks went back to the time of the first settlers of New England. My great-great-grandfather came on the Mayflower, he said. A direct descendant. There is documentary evidence. I felt like a ghost at this table, invisible but at the same time unbearably alien, like a stain on a snow-white tablecloth. I was out of place and everyone realized it, especially my son, who never once looked in my direction after the waiters served the main course. I took a sip of tea, trying to collect my thoughts. What am I doing here in the first place? Why did I come? To make sure that my son had finally become a stranger? I already knew that. But something inside me still clung to hope. Maybe I should try again. To join the conversation. To show that I was not just an old woman who happened to be at this table, but the mother of the main culprit of the celebration? There was a short pause in Harlan's conversation with his colleagues, and I decided to seize the moment. Harlan, I said, trying to make my voice sound calm and confident, tell us about your new project, the one you mentioned the last time you called? My voice sounded louder than I expected. The conversations around the table fell silent for a moment, and all eyes turned to me. I felt the blood rush to my face. Harlan looked surprised and annoyed at the same time. His eyes, so similar to Freeman's, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. What project, Mom? He asked with a subtle note of impatience in his voice. I tried to recall the details of our last conversation, which had been so brief and superficial. Harlan quickly looked at Mr. Davison, and I instantly realized that I had said something inappropriate. They exchanged a wordless dialogue that made me feel even more uncomfortable. Oh, you mean that, he said with a tight smile. No, that's confidential information. I can't discuss it over dinner. It's a trade secret, you know. Oh, of course, I'm sorry, I said quickly. I wasn't thinking. Verna was just wondering how you were doing, Harlan, Telsey said with feigned friendliness, though her eyes remained cold. But I think it's going to be hard for your mom to understand the financial stuff. It's a whole different world. Several people at the table laughed discreetly. I felt something snap inside me. Do they really think I'm that stupid? Me, who had been studying, reading, developing all my life? The one who helped Harlan with his first economic theories when he was just starting to get interested in finance? Actually, I said, trying to maintain my dignity, even though my voice was trembling slightly. I've always been interested in economics. When Harlan was little, we used to read the economic news together, didn't we, son? I even took extra courses in college to better understand what he was studying. The table was completely silent. Harlan was looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher: surprise, embarrassment, shame. Telsey rolled her eyes so that everyone in the room could see it. It seemed to me that even the waiters standing against the wall were holding their breath. It's been a long time, Harlan finally said with a tight smile. The world of finance has changed since then, Mom. A lot. Things work very differently now. He spoke to me in the tone of voice of an adult explaining something to a small child. Instructive, condescending. I felt anger rising inside me, but I restrained myself. It's much easier to explain modern economics to children, Lori suddenly interjected, looking at me with an undisguised challenge. We're already in 8th grade, learning the basics of investing and stock trading. Our teacher says that our generation has a much better understanding of the digital economy than. She didn't finish, but everyone understood. Than old people like you. Paxton, not wanting to fall behind his sister, added, There's a whole club at my school where we play on a virtual exchange with virtual money. I already have a virtual portfolio worth 5 million. Everyone at the table cheered enthusiastically, praising the children's ingenuity and enterprise. Even Mr. Davison nodded in approval, as if he were sitting in front of experienced financiers instead of teenagers. That's great, I said, trying to sound sincere. I'm really glad you're starting to understand these things so early. In my day, you didn't start studying economics until college. Kids today are so much more advanced than they were in my day, Telsey said, patting Lowry's head in a gesture that seemed overly rehearsed. Globalization, the internet, access to information, it gives them an incredible advantage. They were born into the digital world, not having to adapt to it like we did. Yes, I agreed. Although I still think that knowledge of history and cultural context is just as important as financial literacy. To know where we came from in order to understand where we are going. I tried to speak calmly, but I felt something in my tone change. Perhaps it was resentment for all the hours I had spent sitting with Harlan over his textbooks, explaining complex historical concepts, helping him with his homework, encouraging his curiosity. It's a very conservative view, Mr. Davison said with a condescending smile. But the world moves on. The past is the past. The future belongs to those who can adapt and change. Harlan is a great example of a person who has managed to transcend his origins. To transcend his origins. These words hit me like a slap in the face. So they all knew? They knew that Harlan grew up in a simple family, that his father was an ordinary engineer, and his mother was a school teacher? And they congratulated him on the fact that he had overcome this, as if it were some kind of disease or disability. My father used to say, I looked directly at Harlan, feeling my voice tremble, that a person without understanding his past is like a tree without roots. At the first strong wind, it falls over. There was another awkward pause. Telsey didn't even try to hide her irritation. She rolled her eyes. Lori giggled, covering her mouth with her hand and exchanging glances with Paxton. Thank you for your wisdom, Verna, Telsey said with a smile so forced her face looked like a mask. But I think we should get to the toasts. She looked at her husband. Darling, your colleagues probably want to say a few words to celebrate your promotion. Harlan nodded with obvious relief and raised his glass. Indeed, I would like to thank everyone who came today. It means a lot to me. Mr. Davison wasted no time in standing up and giving a pompous speech. He spoke of Harlan as a financial genius, his strategic thinking, his ability to find opportunities where others see only risks. He praised his dedication to the company, his ambition, his incredible ability to connect with the right people. Everyone nodded and applauded when he finished. Then Ms. Caldwell got up. She told a few stories about how Harlan had impressed the company's management with his ideas, how quickly he had risen through the ranks, how everyone had seen his potential right away. And I'll tell you this, she finished, raising her glass. Harlan Thornton is the future of our company. In 10 years, he will be sitting in my seat, or even higher. Everyone applauded again. Harlan was beaming with pleasure. Next to him, Telsey looked like a queen at a coronation. One by one, the guests stood up and complimented my son. I listened and felt a strange mixture of emotions, pride in his professional achievements and pain from the realization of the cost of their achievement. At the cost of abandoning his own roots, of the values that Freeman and I had tried to instill in him. When everyone had finished and there was a short pause, I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to say a few words as well. I am his mother, after all. The person who has known him longer than anyone else at this table. I stood up, holding my glass of water. I hadn't drunk the wine that was served with dinner. I'd like to say a few words too. Harlan instantly tensed up. I could see it in the way his back straightened, the way his jaw clenched. Tessie gave him a worried look as if to ask, Are you going to let this happen? But I had already started talking. I remember when Harlan was little, he always said he wanted to be like his dad, strong, honest, reliable. But he also dreamed of achieving more. "I'm going to be an important person, Mom," he would tell me as we sat on the porch of our house and looked up at the stars. "I'm going to make you and Dad proud." I felt my throat catch. Harlan was staring somewhere above my head, his face frozen like a mask. Telsey tapped her fingernail impatiently on the table. "I think he proved today that he's fulfilled his dream. He's become an important man. And I trailed off for a moment, feeling my voice tremble. "I'm proud of him. Even though his father didn't live to see this day, I know he would be proud too. He always believed in you, Harlan." I raised my glass. "To you, son. To your accomplishments." The silence that followed my words was so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one raised a glass in response. No one said the traditional "to Harlan." Everyone just stared. Some at me, some at Harlan, some at their glasses or at the tablecloth. Even the waiters seemed to be holding their breath. I sat down slowly, feeling my hands trembling. What had I done wrong? Why is everyone reacting as if I said something terrible? Shouldn't I have the right to be proud of my son's success? Harlan was the first to break the unbearable silence. He forced himself to smile, a smile that didn't touch his eyes, and said, too loudly, too cheerfully, "Thank you, Mom. Now can we move on to dessert?" The conversation gradually resumed, but I could feel the tension at the table increase several times over. Telsey was saying something quietly to Harlan, leaning in close to his ear. He nodded with a tense expression, occasionally throwing quick glances at me. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke for itself. They were discussing me, and this discussion was far from complimentary. The waiters brought out sumptuous desserts that looked more like works of art than food. My portion was a real architectural marvel, something chocolate with golden flakes on top, with berries, caramel spirals, and some kind of incomprehensible foam around the edges. At any other time, I would have been amazed by such a culinary masterpiece, but now I couldn't even bring myself to touch it. My stomach was in a tight knot, my mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking so badly that I was afraid to drop my fork. Several times I tried to rejoin the conversation, commenting on the weather, the architecture of the restaurant, even the new design of the town square. But each time I ran into a wall of polite ignorance or outright hostility. Telsey could no longer hide her irritation. She looked at me as if I were an annoying fly circling a birthday cake. Lori caught her mother's gaze several times and smiled, looking at me with outright disdain. "How did you get here, Verna?" Mrs. Caldwell suddenly asked, breaking the pause when I tried to join the conversation once again and was again met with silent rejection. "Do you have a car?" "No, I called a taxi," I replied, glad that someone was finally addressing me directly. "Oh," she exchanged a meaningful look with Telsey. "And how do you like modern taxis? Do you use smartphone apps or do you hail them the old-fashioned way, by phone?" I instantly realized the implication of this question. They all thought I was a technologically illiterate old woman who didn't understand the modern world. "Yes, I use the Uber app," I said calmly. "It's very convenient. I also order groceries online, use online banking, and even sometimes participate in video conferences with my former school colleagues." The surprise on Ms. Caldwell's face was almost comical. "Wow, that's progressive," she said with a hint of disbelief. "You must be very tech-savvy for," she stuttered, clearly looking for a delicate way to say, "for your age." "For my age?" I smiled, deciding not to make it easy for her. "You know, age is just a number. My husband always said that the mind has no age if you keep training it." "That's so sweet," Mrs. Caldwell said in a tone of voice that you use with a small child who has said something funny. "He was the best man I ever knew," I said simply, feeling my heart clench at the memory of Freeman. "He taught me many things, but the most important thing was to be true to myself." "Dad was a good man," Harlan suddenly interrupting our conversation. His voice sounded strange, as if he were both defending his father's memory and making excuses for him. "But he always refused to take risks. If he had been a little bolder in his financial decisions, maybe you wouldn't have had to live so modestly, Mom." I couldn't believe my ears. Freeman had worked his whole life to provide for his family. He denied himself many things so that Harlan could get the best education possible. He always put our needs before his own. And now his son, who received a prestigious education thanks to his father's frugality, is insinuating that his father was not ambitious enough? That he let the family down by not earning enough money? Your father provided us with everything we needed, I said quietly but firmly, feeling the anger building inside me. We had our own house, you got a great education, we never went hungry. He worked overtime to pay for your college. We never lived in luxury, but we always lived with dignity. Oh, no doubt, Harlan said quickly, clearly regretting having brought it up in the first place. I'm just saying that with his education, he could have done better if he had been willing to take risks. Some people aren't cut out for risk, Harlan, Mr. Davison said, a look of false wisdom on his face. That's fine. It just means their ceiling for achievement is lower. Your father gave you a start, and you have already taken a decisive step forward. This is the natural order of things. Several people at the table nodded in agreement with this wisdom. I felt real anger boiling in my chest. How dare they judge Freeman, these people who never knew him, who never saw him work 2 jobs so we could make ends meet after Harlan was born? How he denied himself a new suit to buy his son an encyclopedia. My husband wasn't afraid of risk, I said, feeling my voice grow louder and firmer. He just understood that the most important thing in life is not money or status. It's family, it's close people, it's the ability to look them in the eye and not be ashamed of your actions. He never measured success by the thickness of his wallet or the brand of his car. The table fell silent. Everyone realized that this was not just a defense of Freeman. It was a challenge to their values, their way of life, everything they held important and right. Harlan nervously tapped his fingers on the table, his face tense. Telsey looked at him with obvious expectation, as if demanding some action. Lowry and Paxton looked at each other with frank curiosity, sensing the drama approaching. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then it happened. Harlan slowly stood up, looked around the table, lingering on Mr. Davison's face, then on Telsa, on the children, and finally looked at me. He had a strange, intense smile on his face, as if he had made some important decision and now had to fulfill it, no matter how difficult it was. Mom, he said clearly, loudly, so that everyone at the table could hear his words. This table is for family. You can wait outside. I was numb. The world around me seemed to stop. My son's words echoed in my head like the ringing of a funeral bell. I could not believe I was hearing it. Not from my son, not from the boy I had carried under my heart, whom I had raised, educated, supported, loved with all my being. What? I could only say, feeling my throat dry. But Harlan repeated himself, this time even louder, even more clearly, as if he was driving the final nail into the coffin of our relationship. This table is for family, Mom, for my family. You can wait outside. Someone at the table laughed softly. It seemed to be one of Telsey's friends, then someone else. And suddenly, almost everyone was laughing, some openly, some trying to hide their laughter behind a napkin or a fake cough. I looked at Harlan, searching his eyes for some sign that this was a joke, a bad joke, that he was going to smile and say, "Just kidding, Mom. Of course you're part of our family." But his eyes were serious, even stern. And then I realized this was no joke. My son had just publicly disowned me, excluded me from the concept of family in front of all these people. Telsey didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She had a frank, triumphant smile on her face. Lowry and Paxton looked surprised, but also kind of pleased that their father was being so cool with their grandmother. Mr. Davison watched the scene with cold curiosity, as if assessing how committed Harlan was to the company and its values. I felt something inside me snap, the last thread connecting me to my son. 42 years. 42 years of a mother's love, sleepless nights at his bedside, worrying when he was sick, being proud of his successes, supporting him in his failures. 42 years of my life given to this man, and all of that had just been wiped out in one sentence. I stood up slowly, trying to maintain my dignity, even though my hands were shaking. I understand, I said quietly, but clearly enough. I started to push back my chair to leave when Harlan suddenly gestured to the waiter standing against the wall. He quickly approached, holding a black leather folder. "The bill," Harlan said in a businesslike tone. "Please give it to my mother." The waiter froze for a moment, clearly surprised by this request. A shadow of embarrassment flashed across his face, but his professional mask quickly returned. "Your bill, ma'am," he said in a neutral tone, but in his eyes I saw something like sympathy. With trembling hands, I opened the folder. The amount stunned me, even though I was prepared for something like this. $2,200 for one dinner, an amount that for me meant several months of living on my modest pension. Harlan looked at me with an open challenge in his eyes. His eyes said, "Well, Mom, how about it? You said you had money for dinner. Prove it." The rest of the guests watched with morbid curiosity, some with outright gloating. It was the last, most brutal act of humiliation, the last blow to my dignity, delivered by the hand of my own son. Telsey leaned over to Harlan, whispered something in his ear, and they both exchanged conspiratorial smiles. Lori kept her eyes on me with the ravenous curiosity of a teenager watching a car accident. I stared at the bill in silence, then slowly looked up at my son. The man sitting at the table across from me was not the Harlan I had known and loved all my life. It was someone else cold, ruthless, ready to humiliate his own mother in front of strangers for what? The approval of these rich snobs? A sense of power? I did not know and did not want to know. The only thing I realized at that moment was that my son had died for me. Not physically, but emotionally and morally. The person who was looking at me now with a cold challenge in his eyes was not my child. My Harlan was dead, and his place was taken by this strange, cruel man in an expensive suit. I looked at him in silence, for the first time that evening not looking away first, and slowly, defiantly slid the bill back across the table to him. Our eyes met, and I saw something flicker in his gaze. Surprise? Shame? Regret? But it lasted only a moment, and then his eyes turned cold and alien again. I slowly pushed the bill back. The gazes of everyone in the room were on me. Some with outright gloating, some with shame, some with curiosity, like a crowd watching a street performance. Telsey pressed her lips into a thin line, her eyes sparkling with triumph. Lowry and Paxton looked at each other in amazement. And my son, he looked confused, as if he hadn't expected such a reaction. I stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate. I had never felt so calm and so confident in my actions in my life. It was as if something had crystallized inside me, a clear understanding of what I had to do. "Well," I said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you for the lesson, Harlan. I always knew you were a bright student, but I didn't think you'd learn the lesson of contempt so well. I certainly didn't teach you that." I grabbed my purse and was about to leave when Harlan, seemingly having recovered a bit, held out his hand. "Mom, wait, this is just a joke?" I shook my head. "It's not a joke, it's a choice. Your choice." And with that, I turned around and left the restaurant. No one followed me. No one called me. Not even my own son. It was chilly outside. Providence was sparkling with lights in the evening, and somewhere in the distance, thunder was rumbling. A storm was approaching. I stopped for a moment, breathing in the fresh air that seemed sweeter than any perfume in a stuffy restaurant. I called a taxi using the app on my phone. While waiting, I looked at the majestic Loscari building with its marble columns and thought about how bizarre life is. The building that used to be a bank, a place where people trusted their money, had now become a restaurant where my own child decided that I was not worth her time, her money, her family circle. The taxi arrived 7 minutes later. The driver, a young woman with bright green hair, smiled kindly. "Rough night?" she asked, looking at me in the rearview mirror. "The last one," I answered briefly, and gave her the address. On the way home, I looked out the window at the city that had been my home for 45 years. I knew every street, every corner. This is where Freeman and I bought our first and only house. Harlan was born here. Here I taught history at school and Freeman worked at the factory. Here we lived a modest but happy life, full of love and mutual respect. The streets were wet and shiny after the recent rain. A thunderstorm was approaching, but had not yet reached the city. "Here we are," the driver said, stopping in front of my house. I paid the fare, gave her a generous tip, and got out. My old but well-kept house looked quiet and dark. I opened the door and entered a silence that seemed almost tangible. Kicking off my shoes, I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Habitual actions calmed me down and gave me time to collect my thoughts. After making the tea, I sat down at the table where Freeman and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 42 years. Freeman, I said to the void, what did we do wrong? There was no answer, but I felt as if I could sense my husband's presence, his invisible support. He has always been my rock, my anchor. And now, when our son turned his back on me, on both of us, I felt his absence especially acutely. I stayed in the kitchen until late at night, thinking about everything that had happened and what was going to happen next. Surprisingly, I felt neither tears nor hysteria, only a deep, all-encompassing sadness and, the strangest thing, relief. It was as if something that had been brewing for a long time had finally happened, and now I was free to move on. Before I went to bed, I took a photo album out of the drawer. I flipped through the pages, looking at the photos of little Harlan, smiling, happy, with sparkling eyes. Here he is with his father fishing. Here he is on his first day at school, proudly holding his backpack. Here is his graduation. He is so handsome in a suit that we could barely afford. Did this happy child turn into a cold, arrogant man who publicly disowned his mother? When did this happen? How could I have missed the moment when my son became a stranger? I closed the album and put it back in the drawer. This was no time for sentimental memories. It was time to make a decision. The next morning, I woke up with an unusual sense of determination. I drank coffee, ate toast, and sat down to draw up an action plan, as if I were preparing for a lesson at school. First, a lawyer. I need to change my will. I called Marcus Bloomfield, an old friend of Freeman's who had helped us with legal matters over the years. Really? He was surprised to hear my voice. Is something wrong? I need to change my will, Marcus. I need to change it as soon as possible. He was quiet for a second. Of course. Can you come over at 2 this afternoon? I'll be there. Marcus met me at his modest office downtown. He hadn't changed much since the last time I'd seen him, at Freeman's funeral. A little more gray hair, a few deeper wrinkles around his eyes, but the same penetrating gaze. So what happened? He asked as we sat down at his desk. I briefly, without unnecessary emotion, told him about the dinner and about my decision to completely sever relations with my son and his family. And I want to change the will so that they get nothing, not a single cent. Marcus looked at me with a long, appraising stare. Are you sure about this, Verna? It's a big step. I've known Harlan since I was a kid. He's always been a good guy, I agreed. But people change, Marcus, sometimes irrevocably. He sighed. Okay. What do you want to do with the property? I'd already thought about it. I want to give the house and most of the savings to the local school where I worked. I want them to set up a Freeman Thornton Scholarship Fund for children from low-income families, and a small amount for Georgina Price, my neighbor. Marcus nodded and began to make notes. And personal items? Family photos? Mementos? I wondered. What do we do with things that keep the memory of our lives? I will leave Harlan's photos and personal belongings to him. No matter what kind of person he has become, this is his story, his past. The rest, give it to charity. Okay, Marcus said. I'll prepare all the documents. Will you come to sign the day after tomorrow? Yes, I will. One more thing, Marcus. I'm going to move out of Providence. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. Where? I haven't decided yet, but I don't want to live in this town anymore. There are too many memories. Marcus sighed. I understand. Be careful, Verna. Sometimes decisions made in a state of emotional turmoil can... I'm not in turmoil, Marcus. I interrupted him. I'm completely calm and confident in what I'm doing. He looked at me carefully, then nodded. Good. I'll help with all the legal formalities. After Marcus's office, I went to the bank to check the status of the accounts and discuss some changes. The money Freeman had left me and my own savings gave me enough of a financial cushion to start a new life. Not in luxury, of course, but I had never aspired to luxury. When I got home, I pulled out my phone and blocked Harlan, Telsey, and the kids' numbers. Then I deleted their contacts. It was a strange feeling, like I was erasing a part of my own life. But it was necessary. Then I got on the computer and started looking for information about other cities. Where should I go? Where to start a new life at the age of 67? I considered different options. Big cities were immediately eliminated. Too noisy, too expensive, too many people. Small towns seemed more attractive. Quieter life, lower prices, perhaps friendlier relationships between people. I eventually settled on Portland, Maine. It's a small city on the coast, known for its artistic community, cozy coffee shops, beautiful scenery, and laid-back pace of life. It's not too far from Providence, but it's far enough to start from scratch. I contacted a real estate agent in Portland and explained my situation, an elderly woman looking to start a new life. She was surprisingly understanding and promised to find me several options for small, cozy houses near the center. Now that the plan began to take shape, I felt better. The days passed in preparation for the move. I sorted through my things, decided what to take with me and what to leave behind. It turned out that over 45 years of living in one house, an incredible amount of items had accumulated, most of which I didn't even remember having. One evening, while going through books in my study, I found an old postcard hidden between the pages. It was a postcard Harlan had sent me from a summer camp when he was 11. Mom, it's great here, but I miss you. There is a boy here who brags about his businessman dad, but I told him that my dad is the best in the world because he is real, not just making money. Kisses, your Harlan. I looked at that postcard for a long time, at the child's handwriting, at the slightly crooked drawing of a pine tree on the back. What happened to that boy who valued authenticity more than money? When did he turn into a man for whom status and wealth became more important than family? I put the postcard back between the pages of the book, but then I changed my mind and took it out. It would be part of the letter I would leave for Harlan. The week passed in a rush. I signed a new will, organized the sale of the house, and found movers for my belongings. An agent from Portland sent me photos of several houses, and I chose a small but cozy cottage near the ocean. It cost significantly less than I could get for the sale of my current house, which gave me an extra financial cushion. I met up with a few old friends to say goodbye. Most were surprised by my decision but supportive. None of them knew the real reason I was leaving. I just said I wanted a change of scenery after Freeman's death. Georgina, my neighbor, burst into tears when I told her I was moving. "Who am I going to tell about my roses now?" she asked, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "You'll find a new listener," I replied, hugging her. "And be sure to come visit me in Portland. They say they have beautiful gardens there." The last night before I left, I sat down to write a letter to Harlan. It was not easy. What do you say to a son you've decided to cut out of your life? How do I explain the pain, disappointment, anger, and worst of all, the emptiness I felt? I started writing, crossed it out, and wrote again. Several versions ended up in the trash. In the end, I decided to be as honest as possible, but without accusations or insults. Just the facts. "Harlan, when you receive this letter, I will be far away. I have decided to start a new life in another city. Last week made me reconsider many things, including our relationship. What happened in the restaurant was not an accident or an emotional outburst. It was a reflection of who you have become and who I am to you now, a burden, an inconvenience, an obstacle to the life you dream of. I found your old postcard from the camp, I'm enclosing it, and thought for a long time about when and how you changed. What made you abandon the values that your father and I tried to teach you? But in the end, it doesn't matter anymore. We all make choices that determine our lives. You made yours. Now I'm making mine. I changed my will. You and your family will not receive anything from my estate. I'm not doing this out of revenge. I just think it will better serve children who have dreams but no opportunities. In the box I'm leaving behind are your childhood photos, school awards, postcards you and your father made for us, and some other personal items. They belong to you. What you do with them is up to you. I don't want you to look for me. I don't want calls, letters, or visits. This is not an attempt to make you feel guilty or to make you change. I just finally realized that there is no point in continuing a relationship that brings pain to both parties. I wish you happiness, Harlan. I hope that the status and success you crave will bring you the satisfaction you seek. And I hope that someday you will realize that true wealth is not in money or status, but in the ability to remain human in any circumstance. I read the letter several times, made sure it said exactly what I wanted it to say, and sealed it in an envelope with a children's card. Then I put it in a large cardboard box where I put Harlan's Things albums, school awards, children's drawings, postcards, homemade gifts. The last night in the house where I lived almost all my adult life, I hardly slept. I lay in bed, listening to familiar sounds, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside the window, the distant rumble of trains. This was my home, my refuge, a place where every corner held a piece of my history. But I didn't feel sad, only a strange sense of completion, as if I were turning the last page of a long book. A book that had its joys and sorrows, its ups and downs, but now had come to a logical end. In the morning, I got up early and made my last rounds of the house. In the kitchen, where Freeman and I had breakfast every morning. In the living room, where Harlan was learning to walk. In the bedroom, where my husband and I had spent so many nights talking about the day before and dreaming about the future. I left the box with Harlan's belongings and the letter in the living room, in a visible place. Marcus was to give him the key when all the formalities were completed. I didn't want to meet him. There was nothing to add to what I had already written. The taxi arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. The driver, a friendly elderly man, helped me with my bags. To the airport? He asked. Yes, to the airport, I answered, getting into the car. I did not look back at the house as the taxi drove away. There was no need to. Everything I wanted to remember was already in my heart. Everything else could be left behind. On the way to the airport, we passed familiar streets, buildings, and parks. The city was waking up. People were rushing to work. Children were going to school. Life went on. Without Freeman, and now without Harlan. How long are you going away for? The driver asked as we approached the airport. Forever, I answered. He looked at me in the rearview mirror. At your age? He asked, and then added embarrassedly, Sorry, it's none of my business. It's okay, I smiled. I think it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to make a choice in favor of your dignity. He nodded, as if he understood something more than I had said. Good luck, ma'am. Thank you, I replied, watching the airport building appear on the horizon. A new city, new people, a new life. Without a son who had disowned me. Without grandchildren who barely knew me. Without a past that no longer had power over me.